Good afternoon. I just want to start by saying how much I've enjoyed the past few days, and I've had a great time here, and just want to say thanks to Tim and to Chai and everyone who's made Renaissance such a success. So I think you guys should all give them a round of applause. So today I want to talk to you about using animation in your apps. Animation's importance has been greatly elevated in iOS 7, and over the next few minutes, I want to briefly touch on the history of animation on iOS and look at some of the improvements that have been made in the new system. As we examine how Apple has added and refined animations in their own apps, we'll review a few ways animation can be used to improve usability. So, why are these informative animations important? Let me give you an example. Think of your app as this cup of water. Now, this clip comes from the Disney series Gravity Falls, and I know it's silly, but the point is that using our apps isn't always as clear as we might think, and sometimes subtle guiding animations can help. So in Apple's recently released Tech Talk videos, Mike Stern spent the last several minutes of his app design talk discussing the feel of iOS 7. And during his talk, Mike states that conveying a sense of kinetic realism is going to be a key differentiator in next generation apps. Mike argues that the kinetic realism of iOS 7 is more realistic and alive, while the use of shadows and texture to convey realism in previous versions of iOS was limited and lifeless, because these visual effects are static and they don't respond to the user's movement or their environment. The enhanced kinetic realism of iOS 7 is aided by new tools such as UI Dynamics, the physics engine behind the refined camera activation feature seen here on the lock screen, and motion effects, which powers the 3D parallax effect on the springboard as the user moves their device. Mike emphasizes in his presentation that animation is a key aspect of what defines iOS 7. And though Mike is right, if we aren't careful, we could make the assumption that animation was unimportant before iOS 7 came along. But if we go all the way back to the beginning, the 2008 edition of the iPhone Human Interface Guidelines indicates that animation has always been an important part of iOS. Here, Apple states that animation is a great way to provide feedback to users, as long as it's subtle and meaningful and improves the user's experience. So, sometimes it's easy to forget just how innovative that first iPhone was. How many of you watched Steve Jobs introduce the first iPhone in 2007? So yeah, most of you. I want to show you one of my favorite clips from that announcement. Check out how the audience responds when Steve demonstrates scrolling for the first time.
Now here I am, you see 5 buttons across the bottom, playlist, artists, songs, videos, and more. I'm an artist right now. Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do that? I take my finger and I scroll. Isn't that cool? A little rubber banding up and I went off the edge.
So I love that response, and I like to imagine the audience kind of like this. Yeah. Now I can poke fun here, but this was the Motorola Sliver that I was using when the iPhone was announced. And scrolling through a list of songs with this thing was a chore, because you'd end up scrolling down and you'd run past the song that you wanted, and then you'd have to tap back up several times to get back to where you wanted to be. It could be really annoying. And the thing is, this was one of the nicest phones that was available at the time. Now, at the end of that video, Jobs also points out the rubber banding effect that's still used throughout iOS when the user reaches the end of a view. And this subtle bounce is a great example of how animation can be used to communicate the result of an action. The rubber banding effect, like scrolling itself, is easy for us now to take for granted, but it serves an important purpose. Because people are so used to computers hanging and stalling, this bounce helps reconfirm that the end of the view has been reached and that the device is functioning properly. The passcode lock screen is another great example. Here on the left, we see how the lock screen used to behave when you entered the wrong passcode. While on the right, the new iOS7 version is more efficient and playful and lightens the tone of what is otherwise a negative and stressful situation. So I think this is a really nice, subtle improvement. Next, let's look at how animation can be used to indicate status. Custom loading animations are a good place to start here. These animations are a lot of fun and can help distract your users while information is being retrieved. So here, Find My iPhone playfully presents a compass animation as the app locates your iOS devices. Now, this recently released Yahoo News app presents a nice custom loading animation as well. In this app, Yahoo uses color to represent the various news categories. When the app first launches, these colored dots spin and then they zoom up to reveal the top news story. But as nice as these types of animations can be, here's something you should keep in mind when considering custom loading animations. According to a Facebook A/B test, when Facebook used a custom loading animation, such as the one presented here, users blamed the Facebook app for being slow. But when the user was presented with the standard spinner, and I'm sure some of you are starting to figure this out, when the user was presented with the standard spinner, they were more likely to blame their iPhone for the delay. I find that really fascinating. So on the left, they blame the app, and on the right, they blame the system. So use this knowledge to your advantage. When load times are incredibly long or outside of your control, it might be a good time to share some of the blame with the system. So here in the new Messages app, a bubble appears at the bottom of the screen when a friend is responding to a message. In the previous system, a static word bubble appeared instead of the more appropriate thought bubble. In the new version, the dots also pulse, and the bubble subtly shifts and changes. Now, as small and subtle as these changes are, the new version feels much more organic and alive than the previous version. Custom pull to refresh animations are another great example of representing status through animation. On the left, the Twitter client Twitterrific shows their mascot Ollie hatch, flap his wings, and then disappear. While on the right, in the fitness tracker Shine, content moves back into view with each stroke from the swimmer. And I love that little nice bounce that they have there. It's really great. Next, let's look at the use of animation to imply a gesture. Here on the lock screen, the slide to unlock text shimmer animation draws your attention to the feature and subtly reinforces to the user which direction they need to swipe to unlock their iPhone. And also on the lock screen is the camera bounce animation. Here, tapping the camera icon bounces the view to indicate that you need to swipe up instead of tapping. So this is a really smart interaction since you wouldn't want to trigger this functionality while your iPhone is in your pocket. However, even though the bounce interaction makes perfect sense here on the lock screen, some third-party applications should reconsider its use. In the gesture-driven alarm clock app Rise, by the way, which is a great application, no matter how many times you tap the settings gear at the bottom of the screen, you won't be able to access settings until you swipe up from the icon. Now, each time Rise bounces when a user taps settings, they're telling the user that they did something wrong. And on top of this, the required swipe gesture here has the potential to not only interfere with iOS 7's control center, but the swipe gesture used to set the alarm as well. And unlike on the lock screen, tapping on the settings icon here has no potential bad side effects. The Australian TV listings app OzTV makes a similar mistake. When you view a show's details, OzTV presents a custom control in the top left of the detail overlay, right up there in the top left. This custom control requires a swipe gesture to dismiss. Now, if you tap instead, which is a logical mistake since this is where the back button would normally be, you're stuck in the detail view. Only by holding and sliding the view off can you get back to the TV listings. Now, compare this to the iPad Photos app. The pinch gesture in the Photos app is one of the nicest and most satisfying gestures on the device. But as much as I love the pinch gesture, when I really use the Photos app, I almost always tap to expand. Now, imagine if Apple didn't allow you to tap, but insisted that you use the pinch gesture and bounce the photo set instead. This would drive me absolutely crazy. We should avoid making the user feel like they did something wrong whenever possible. And that means sometimes honoring a tap, even if someone might miss the clever gesture or transition that you spent all that time on. Here in the new Game Center application is a nice lesson in maintaining consistency. Watch what happens here when I tap on the segmented controls in the Friends section. That nice custom transition they worked in is a clear indicator to me that I can swipe between these segments. So let's see what happens when I try to swipe. Yeah, great. So it tries to unfriend one of my Game Center friends. The fact that the associated gesture not only doesn't work, but is actually potentially destructive, makes this a really ill-advised animation, and you should really guard against things like this. Compare this to the Notification Center in iOS 7, which doesn't animate on tap, but does allow you to swipe between the segmented controls. So here it works exactly the opposite way of the Game Center application that we were just looking at. Now, then go back and look at any of the other segmented controls in the system where they don't animate and you can't swipe. Consistency matters. This is no different than in the previous system on iPad, where the user could turn the pages on iBooks, but couldn't in the Contacts app or in the Calendar app, which both also looked like books. Lack of consistency in gestures and animations can be just as confusing as these skeuomorphic examples. And you should be really careful not to imply a gesture in your animation that doesn't actually work. Next, let's look at transitional animations used to clarify or create a sense of place. In iOS 6, when you launch an application, the app expands up from the center of the screen. But in iOS 7, in an attempt to provide a more seamless sense of place, apps now expand up from their respective app icons. Combining this refined animation with the zoom up transition in the new Calendar app really ties everything together to create a clear hierarchy. Here in Safari, the new tab selector fans the tabs out to show where the current tab lives in relation to the other tabs. By fanning the tabs out, Apple's able to maximize screen real estate, making it much more efficient to navigate tabs in iOS 7 over the previous single-page approach. Okay, so final point. The use of animation to guide the user to a location or touch target. In the day view of the Calendar app, if you select a day other than today and scroll so that the current time is no longer in view, when you move back to today's date, the current time is animated back into view automatically. There's a nice little scroll-up effect that happens by itself. These basic animations are subtle but powerful ways to aid the user. Many shopping and deals apps have started incorporating fun, informative animations to guide users to shopping carts and favorites as well. So here in the local deals and events app Scout Mob, barber trimmers flip your stash, a little mustache, onto the guy who slides down from the menu in the top left, confirming that your stash items can be accessed there. So there's no mystery where those items are going to end up. And finally, the Zappos Cart Cat. And some of you have probably seen this before. Here when you select Add to Cart, Cart Cat swoops down from the button with your item and delivers it to your shopping cart. So it's really pretty absurd. But if you think people don't notice or care about things like this, do a Twitter search for Zappos Cart Cat sometime. These types of fun details are like the Sesame Street of app education. And on top of encouraging people to buy more items, experiences like this are so overwhelmingly delightful that it's easy to forget that you're actually learning something. So I hope this quick overview has been helpful. Although animation has been around since the beginning of iOS, the refined animations and simplified visual aesthetic of iOS 7, along with new tools such as UI dynamics and motion effects, has really increased the importance of animation in our apps. As you build new apps and continue to improve existing apps for iOS 7, I hope you'll consider how you can use subtle, meaningful animation to improve usability in your own apps. Thanks.
thank you, Rusty. That was very informative about all the animations that we could start using in our apps and how we can think about what kinds of animations you want to put in so there's no confusion as to what you can do next. So next we have Peter Newell, who's going to tell us about optimizing legibility in iOS 7. And he has some great information for us on what happened during the iOS 7 betas.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. While deciding on a topic and a title for this talk, I came across this great definition of legibility, and I want to share it with you. I had always thought about legibility as just how readable text or handwriting is, and it turns out it's far greater. I'd completely misunderstood. It's about deciphering. It's about visually discovering something and making it instantly understandable. Software and operating system design present a couple really unique challenges. First, you often don't know what the content in your app will be. And second, you have to make sure that it performs in an infinite number of scenarios. On top of these, we often want to express a sense of our app's personality or our brand identity. I'd like to focus on the visual style of iOS 7 and how we as developers and designers can transition the appearance of our apps while actually improving overall usability and legibility. I have some examples and trends and considerations that I've noticed in my work, and I'd like to share those with you. We'll start small and work our way up to some greater legibility issues. Let's start with color. Color is not only beautiful, it is an important and powerful tool for defining user interface elements like buttons or for expressing the personality of your app or brand. In minimalist layouts like those in iOS 7, color is one of the few, but it's really one of the best tools at your disposal. But color can behave differently in each scenario, and it's immensely important to understand this, considering how unpredictable the content in your app may be. Here's some examples. Colors look different on different backgrounds. Now put this in context where a lot of iOS 6 apps used grayish backgrounds, and iOS 7 apps typically use white backgrounds. And this effect is magnified whenever you use thinner font weights. In scenarios like this, I suggest simply tweaking the colors so that they appear to be just right. This is an important lesson for buttons, too. Here's a typical iOS 6 style button. And when we strip it of the gloss and really get down to its essence, it's a big shape filled with a lot of color. But in iOS 7, we typically use text or colored text for buttons, occasionally with a thin border. But text and thin lines give you a lot less of the color itself. And that's actually really important whenever you rely on color to convey a specific functionality or to express your brand identity. Small changes in color can have a far greater impact on overall usability and legibility in your app. So as one of the most powerful tools available to you, choose your colors carefully. Start seeing color as a tool. Now, a lot of the examples I just showed are just as much about text or buttons as they are about the backgrounds themselves. Clearly, backgrounds have a monumental impact on legibility. So let's talk about backgrounds in iOS 7. In order to do so, we need to understand one of the three principles of iOS 7 design. Apple calls it deference. What that means is that the interface surrenders to the content. It defers to the content. Photos are as large as possible. Text is clear and readable. Essentially, get your interface out of the way. Now, this effort to defer everything to the content completely aligns with iOS 7's use of translucency. By using background blurs for toolbars and topmost levels of the interface, users get the impression that they can still see their content right there underneath. The translucent toolbars in the video app, for example, allow the video to feel like it's still taking up the whole screen. But Apple ran into a lot of scenarios where this new style destroyed legibility and overall usability. You may remember a few of these from iOS 7's beta releases. This is the Maps app. Notice how beautifully the colors show through the toolbar, but how they show through with a totally different background and break legibility. This is the Clocks app. Now, half the time, your clocks are going to be black, but unfortunately, that rightmost icon will totally disappear in those scenarios. Apple addressed this in a few ways. So there's a really important problem here, and that's that icons and text in a blurred toolbar will always disappear when a background of a similar color is behind that toolbar. There are really just too many possible backgrounds. So here's what Apple did. They did a couple things. First, they increased the amount of blur. This helped to soften and spread out high contrast areas like the clock. Second, they added a semi-transparent layer of color, often white, to ensure that the background could never get so dark as to impede the legibility of text and icons. Here's some before and afters. Big change in the Maps app. They really had to limit the possibilities in the background. And finally, we can see the search bar. Now, these may be tricks that you can use in your own apps, but the most important takeaways is the process of limiting possibilities. When building software that needs to perform in every scenario, limiting possibilities is the only way to ensure legibility. Now, Apple's situation is just one example of a broader challenge in UI design. That challenge is how to overlay an interface on top of unpredictable background content. Here's some approaches that you can use in your own apps. Well, you can ignore it to assume that it'll look pretty good in most situations. Now, unfortunately, even when you do have control over the background, this can often come back to bite you when using fluid or responsive layouts. Unfortunately, ignoring it is far too common. The lock screen in iOS 7 is an example of adaptive design. Most wallpapers cause the time and text to be white, but an image sampling algorithm changes that color to gray for really light wallpapers. Now, this color is used in all text that's on top of that wallpaper, including in the home screen. As you can see, it's a nice feature, but it's not enough to ensure legibility everywhere. Adaptive design like this is pretty cool, but it's difficult to pull off, and it requires considerably more engineering effort. Toolbars. Although toolbars are a familiar UI element, even for tech-averse users, they take up a lot of space in order to give padding to the elements inside. Now, Apple still uses toolbars all over the place, and I see this as an area that may be improved in future versions of iOS. Some of the best examples of interface over content use gradients and subtle shadows. This provides control over the background, but it fades out in a far more subtle way than toolbars. When the Facebook app needs to show captions, stats, and buttons, on top of a full screen photo, they apply this technique with a dark gradient. Now I've actually mocked up what it would look like without the gradient or text shadows. Somebody pointed out to me the other day how much time and effort Facebook has spent perfecting the color blue. Not just to represent their brand, but to actually optimize for click rates. Now in a situation like this, all of that work is instantly destroyed, instantly useless. It's amazing how much a little darkening can do to ensure legibility across any photo posted by a user. Now, it doesn't need to be a dark background, obviously. Here's a lighter example. This is PhotoStream comments. We all want to know that our apps look great and perform flawlessly in every scenario. This is a challenge inherent in designing any system or tool. And if you aren't careful, adopting iOS 7's visual style can have a detrimental impact on legibility in your app. We talked about color, how it looks on different font weights, how we perceive it, how it behaves on different backgrounds. We talked about Apple's struggle to make background blurs beautiful without sacrificing legibility. And applying the method of limiting possibilities, we talked about the different ways to overlay an interface on top of background content that is entirely out of your control. Legibility is the backbone of design. So as you transition the design of your apps, take this opportunity to make colors the best they can be, to make text the clearest it can be. Apply the principle of deference to make your content come forward and let your interface get out of the way. So in your next update, don't just give your app a quick facelift. Use these strategies to improve legibility and actually make it the best version you've ever shipped. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Do you want to put the next one on? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Come on up. So next we have Didier Hilhorst.
That's right.
I'm sorry?
No, that's right.
Oh, good. I'm glad I got that right.
Who
Who will speak to us?
That looks good, but I need to go to the beginning.
Oh, to the beginning, right.
I can start halfway. That would be interesting.
A new kind of talk. We're going to do middle, and then the end, and then the beginning.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sorry. Hi there. I'm Didier Horst. I work as a product designer at Flipboard. I've been there for about 3 years. So we've seen quite a few iOS versions, actually. So what I'm going to talk about today is details matter. We'll see what that means. Less interface, more content, which seems pretty obvious for Flipboard. And then experimentation and iteration. Because I think both what Rusty talked about and Peter talked about require a lot of that. It's really hard to get it right the first time, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how we deal with that at Flipboard. So really quick, I don't know, how many of you know Flipboard? Okay, skip. I don't have to explain Flipboard then. That's good. So details matter. Actually, it's quite funny. When I was asked to speak here and I knew it was iOS 7 specifically, I wasn't entirely sure what to talk about, and I'll explain why. This is why. Which one is which? So I need to help. OK, left is iOS 6. Right is iOS 7. So there's a bit of a difference. It's mostly there. Now, obviously, we were very happy with the release of iOS 7. We're like, oh, it's all going to look like Flipboard. That's great. But actually, what I want to talk about is those details, because I think they do matter. And we spend quite a bit of time going through that. So here, too, look at the bottom of the screen. You'll see that there's quite a bit of a difference between those two. And you might say, well, why did you change it? There's so little difference between the two. But I think it helps to really feel at home in iOS 7. And that goes from giving space to the content, which we obviously already did, but also sort of marrying the visual language to the platform you're designing for. So we set out to redesign all of the icons that you see throughout the system. And as you can see, and most of you have used iOS 7, I'm sure, for a while now, the strokes are more thin. It sort of fits in the style of iOS 7. So this is actually something that I think any app developer, designer can do, sort of go through, make sure it feels at home in the screen when you're switching from app to app. So very simple exercise. The other thing we did is we changed the icon. You might think there's not much difference here, but what I personally noticed when we installed Flipboard on iOS 7 is that suddenly the color felt off. It was too dark. It didn't feel right with the sort of neon that Johnny Ive decided to start using. So we adjusted the color slightly to give it a bit more orange in the top section, give it more of a gradient, so it fits in more naturally with iOS 7 and the start screen. And you might think that doesn't really matter that much, but we actually got a few tweets. People appreciated that the icon was changed and it looked at home. So no matter how small the detail, people will appreciate it, whether that's directly or indirectly. And I actually think that good design usually goes unnoticed. People prefer to complain. So that's sort of the details matters. I wanted to talk a little bit about less interface, more content. Because I think that one of the things that iOS 7 does very well is really give priority to the content. So Peter talked a lot about this. Apple calls it Deference. We just call it, that's what we do at Flipboard. So let's dive in a little bit. So this is, these are both the first screens that you see when you start Flipboard. And I'm going to focus on the phone version. So the funny thing here is that I didn't calculate it, but I would say only 5% of this screen is actually functional in the sense that it's a UI element. The rest is big tiles of content, and any one of those you can tap and go into content. But we're using content to infer that because you can touch it. So we didn't clutter this up with a lot of UI elements. We decided purposefully to focus the attention on the content for 95% of the screen. So we also do this for other pieces of content once you go into a feed. So obviously, a fashion spread like this, you can take up the whole screen on a phone. We don't always do that. We're not going to do it if a photo is more well-suited to be in portrait, for example. So you have to respect the content. You can't just crop 80% of the picture out just to make sure that you fill up the screen. And here's another example of a different layout. So you really want to be adaptive in what you do with the content and respect the content at the same time, not just for the sake of filling up the screen. So that's really what less UI, more content looks like. I think iOS 6 was very heavy on a lot of buttons, a lot of layers. I think with the calendar app, for example, they've decided to rely much more on transitions and things like that, and take away some of the controls and give the content priority. I wanted to talk a little bit about experimentation and iteration, because some things took us a little bit to figure out. Some things we haven't figured out yet, so I'll step through that. So let's take this article, for example. So we're going to start, and then I had fancy animations in here. They got killed. All right, no fancy animations. You start with the background, and you put in the title of the article. You put in a status bar. I'll talk more about that status bar in a second. You put in the header with some of the controls of your UI. You put in who shared the story, and you put in some, oh, that was an animation. You put in some of your actions that you want people to interact with. So that sort of completes from the start of an article how it might look like on Flipboard. And I think you can do that exercise. And really what it means is that you start layering all these things. And I think you can do the same thing for your app. You can start layering it, decide what is important, what is not important, defer it to another screen if it gets too busy. And I think iOS 7 makes that a lot easier because they give a great example in a lot of their apps. So as you notice here, the status bar is black. Most apps use a translucent status bar. So we spent about a week experimenting with trying to make that status bar translucent. Because wouldn't it be great if it looked something like this, which would be absolutely amazing. Problem is, Flipboard does not scroll. It flips. So just to show you what happens when you flip, imagine flipping down from the left to the right. What happens is that black status bar suddenly doesn't look so good anymore. The problem is we cannot connect the flip angle to the color of the status bar. You can only do it when it lands or when the event completes. So we complained to Apple. We said we can't do your stuff because you're not giving us the right tools to do it. So I think there's much more in iOS 7 that will get better and that we'll have access to. So for the time being, we decided that it was better experience for Flipboard to use the black status bar, because changing the color of the status bar every time a page flip ends was extremely distracting. So that's where we decided to move away from what you might call standard on iOS 7 and deviate from that, because it was just not a good user experience. So the point here is that you don't have to follow every single piece of advice literally. You have to also think about the user experience in the context of your own application. So, and this is what it takes to iterate. At Flipboard, we do a lot of work and try a lot of things, both on paper, but also prototypes. These days, you can use a lot of web technologies to prototype your interaction, see how it feels, see how it works. And that's something that I think is really, really important to try to iterate, to test, to change, to experiment with all of the different ways, both animation, as Rusty said, color, and other aspects of your application, as Peter explained. I think a lot of it is just testing and testing again. So that's something we do a lot at Flipboard, and something we did a lot with iOS 7 too. We had a few releases that we improved upon release after release. So to summarize, as I said, details matter. It's not just about aesthetics, but I think it's something tactical you can do so that your app feels both professional and is pleasant to use. And I've seen most apps have done that. There's still a few lagging, but most apps have done this. More importantly and more philosophically is less interface, more content. And that doesn't mean that you have no interface, obviously. You don't want to confuse users in how they should use your app. But I think it's just rethinking and layering and seeing how and what applies to your application. And then the last one is really about experimentation and iteration. I think you have to experiment and see what works for your platform. And that was it. Thank you very much.
You should stay up here because we're going to do a quick Q&A. If anybody has questions for Rusty, Didier, or Peter, please raise your hands because there's going to be a
Spread out.
I think we can stand.
a runner around with the microphone. So it looks like there's a lot of questions, so let's get started.
Hi, what kind of tools do you use to prototype at Flipboard?
I've seen everything from paper to Keynote to more advanced prototyping using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. But if you know how to fold a piece of paper, go for it. I don't think it matters. It gets more advanced after that, but we prototype a lot with web technologies, especially since the last 2 years it has advanced a lot in what you can do.
At Flipboard, sorry again to you, Didier. Do you guys do any content recognition of the photos, or do you just place them based on whether they're portrait or landscape? Because I know that when you start cropping things, it doesn't always look the best when you don't control the content.
Very good question. We do. We do a lot of content analysis. We do face detection. We do edge detection. We do object detection. Some of it has shipped, so face detection is actually exists in the app, and we will try to not crop out faces, although sometimes we choose the wrong face. But yes, there's a lot more ongoing. That's one of the things that we'll be working on more and more, especially to respect the content and give it, the attention it's due.
This is for all three panelists. Looking forward to iOS 8, what's the one thing you would like most to see Apple change in iOS 8 that you think would help your consumers the most?
Good debate question.
Wow. You go first.
Sure. Mostly it's little things. I'm sure we've all got about a dozen at least of little things we'd like to see changed. I think that there are a lot of places that that can be not only more legible, but just like, well, I guess it is more legible. It's just more clear. Using layering and transitions to give people a better sense of spatial awareness. I think when people opened up an iOS 6 app, they were able to pretty quickly understand what they were looking at and where things were. And oftentimes in iOS 7, that takes 5-10 more seconds. That's unnecessary, and it might just be an indication that the visual style won't hold up over time, or won't strictly hold up over time for an operating system or software.
Yeah, I think you're right about the details. As we move forward with that stuff, you really can't think of iOS 7 as necessarily the 7th implementation of iOS. It really is kind of a starting over, and that's not a new way of looking at it, I know, but we should assume that there's going to be lots of refinement to the system. There's a lot of debate amongst designers of whether you like iOS 7 or not, and I really don't think that that's all that fruitful, whether I like it or not. We have to design for the system that we're given, and a lot of times if we reject that, then the inconsistencies that we introduce are worse than the usability issues that are inherent in the system. So, yeah.
Better battery life? No. I think mostly I'll echo what Peter and Rusty said. I think it's going to be an evolution. I think there's improvements to be made. So far, I have to say, if I put on my Flipboard hat, I'm like, it's worked out great for us. It actually fits the OS better now than it used to. So we're looking forward to what Apple has in store. I think, personally, taking my Flipboard hat off for a second, I think it's a good evolution. My only gripe has been that I think a button, it's helpful if it has an outline around it. The whole text thing, I'm not so sure about, but mostly I think it's a great direction. And I think it forces designers and developers to be more thoughtful about what it means to develop a touch interface. So in my book, that's only positive.
I had one other thing that I thought about. The home screen is really dysfunctional a lot of the time, just visually. We've got all these great colors for app icons, and unfortunately, most backgrounds kind of conflict with those colors in some way. iOS 7 got rid of a ton of shadows and the text below an icon and below the icon itself as well. I don't know if you guys see this, but I frequently see two really bright colors right next to each other. And it's almost like there's this faint line, or like my eyes can't perceive two colors. And I think it's actually because it's a screen. It's sometimes having those two colors side by side in print can work really well. But we need to be really considerate about two really bright colors kind of coming at your eyes 1 pixel apart. I'd like to see a lot of visual improvements to the usability of the home screen.
So, any other questions? Or I have a quick follow-on, sort of, to that question is, as far as branding goes, since everything has gone very flat, how do you stand out? How do you make your brand still be a brand?
I don't think that it's the flatness really affects branding too much. I mean, the best brands historically worked best before all of the gradients and texture and stuff came along. The UPS logo and the redesign of it is kind of a good reference point of what was there before and what it became. I don't think that flatness is the issue.
Does flat design and iOS 7's aesthetic impact your brand? It might if if your only product is an app, and that's really it. But kind of some of the branding 101, best practices are have a logo that works really well in a ton of different scenarios, that looks great when it's cut out of something, that looks great in two-tone, that looks great small and large. And honestly, iOS 7 can't change a whole lot of that. A great logo is, as Rusty said, in many cases going to perform just as well.
Other questions? Any other burning questions?
Yes.
I'm just curious where you guys sort of hang out online and what you look at, just from a, share with us, where do you look for inspiration, and what leaders in design, if we want to sort of learn more about this?
You want to go first?
Oh, actually, I don't spend that much time online, to be honest. Mostly busy making a product. But I do, and Rusty showed this in his presentation. I think Apple has actually done a great series of tech talks on iOS 7. And I think it's very thoughtful. I think Mike Stern did a very good job at explaining the philosophy behind it. Aside from that, I think there's some good resource sites. I like to see what competitors, other apps are doing. There's a bunch of websites out there that sort of screen grab like the first launch or other aspects of the app. There's this website called Patterns, PTTRNS.com, for example. Those are great because I don't really need to read opinion. I just want to see and I want to experience it. So I have a lot of apps on my home screen, and they're only there for me to check out what others have thought of, because there's a lot of great minds in app development and design these days. So I would say, look at a lot of examples. We're now at a stage where there's millions of apps, both on iOS and Android. So get out there and see what works and experience it for yourself.
If you want to see some great examples of animations on iPhone applications, there's a website called captivate.co, I believe. There's two P's in Captivate there. I think that it was Ali Dreyer, who used to be at Bottle Rocket, manages that website. It's a really great resource.
Quick question.
I don't have much to add to that.
Quick question for the history of Flipboard, actually where you headed now. For Flipboard, yeah. So I see you're tweaking the UI a little bit to be more like iOS 7, where you're bridging a little bit of a gap. In Android, you're also trying to be closer to the OS. And then how do you balance having a consistent feel, or do you even try to have a consistent feel in Flipboard across platforms with being closer to the OS look and feel?
I think you start with your core experience, right? At Flipboard, we want to be the best personal magazine. So that means we want to provide an experience where it's amazing to read your content, go in and flip through it. So you'll see a lot of commonalities. Now, there are some platform-specific things, like Android has either hardware or software buttons always present, or it has a contextual button. All of those things become, is not something that Flipboard wants to own. It's something that you defer to the system to, and you take those cues, and implement them. And one of the things we want to do when we launched on Android is that the worst critique you could get 2 years ago was, oh, this looks like an iOS port. So we spend a lot of time to still, the core of what your application or service is independent of platform. The rest is detailing around how you defer to the platform to do certain actions. So that's how we keep track of it. And the same is true for when we do web or Windows releases or whichever platform we're on. You want to use the platform and use the best things that you can do there.
Any other questions? Or I have another question, kind of an open question for the panel. As people are taking their apps forward or redesigning their apps for iOS 7, what are the things that you think they really should keep in mind? What are the key things that you're thinking about as you're designing for iOS 7? So like things like, should you think about the transparencies as they interact with the background that you have in your app, or things like that? Hints, trouble areas.
I think I expressed a lot of those, and I'll just reiterate that you can reskin your app, or you can make this the best design that you've ever shipped, and improving legibility and using, say, larger text with a thinner font weight, which can actually improve legibility. And things like that. Don't let iOS 7's style dictate very strictly what your apps need to look like. Be unique and actually spend the time to make improvements when you need to make changes, especially obviously with color and backgrounds and all the things that I talked about.
How many of you work with clients? Yeah. So how many of you work with clients? Yeah. It's kind of a different approach there, I think, sometimes when you're working with clients. Like what they see as value in iOS 7 is not the same, and so it really can be a hard sell sometimes to convince them that they don't just need to do the kind of basic, make it kind of feel like iOS 7 visually. So I don't have any great tips on how to sell them on something more other than to say, try your best to sell them on something more, because they need more than just thinner icons and flattening out of gradients. It does need to be more than that.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've worked with clients, unless I consider ourselves a client. But I do think it's an opportunity to sort of, even though it might not feel like it in the end result, because your app might end up looking somewhat similar, and sometimes there's only aesthetic differences, but I think it's an opportunity to rethink some of the interactions that you had previously come up with, and really focusing on the content, going back to what are you trying to build and what are the interactions that you want to focus on. I think that helps a lot. Now, to Rusty's point, dealing with clients is a whole other subject, so I'll leave that where it is.
All right. So I think that's it for this panel. And thank you for being with us all 3 days, for those of you who are here all 3 days.
Nice.